Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today, this evening for our talk with Professor Rachel Griffith, who's going to be doing a talk on kind of the question about should the government control what we eat, and discussing kind of the economic policy around that point. Just quickly on our society this term, so as probably is for everything, basically all our events are online, and they'll be on our Facebook page and then posted on our YouTube as well, if you're not able to catch them while we're doing them. So last week we had a few interesting interviews. So we had Ingrid Kvangraven, we had Randall Ray, and we had Niels Rockowitz. And all those talks are on our Facebook page, as well as our YouTube if you want to watch them. And so for this talk specifically, we're really excited to host Professor Rachel Griffith, who, like I said before, will be discussing the kind of idea of should the government control what we eat. She's a professor of economics at the University of Manchester, and so we're really excited to have her here this afternoon. So thank you for joining us, Professor Griffith.
Great, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, whatever that means these days. I'll just share my screen. So what I want to talk about today is the kind of economics behind the extent to which we might think the government should be involved in dictating what people eat. This is a hot topic at the moment in policy circles. The current government is thinking about legislating in a number of ways that I'll talk about in detail, in restricting the way that foods are advertised, the price of foods, and ultimately wanting to control what we eat to some extent. And so I want to talk a little bit about what's the problem, why do we think that we need government intervention, and then what are the possible policy solutions, and what are some of the sort of potential pitfalls that we really need to be careful and think about. So as well as being a professor at the University of Manchester, I'm the research director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. So a lot of the work that I do at the Institute for Fiscal Studies tries to bring academic work and insight into the policy arena. And so that's really what we're doing in this work. Behind everything I'm talking about, it's a lot of econometric analysis of big data, thinking about using economic theory to understand how people and firms behave. But we're really trying to apply that. You won't see a lot of technical detail here. What we're really trying to do is take that technical detail and apply it to think about what are the best and most effective types of policies we could use. So let's get going. So what's the motivation for thinking about this problem? So obesity is actually one of the big challenges that governments face, particularly prior to the pandemic. There's kind of global warming, obesity, and inequality were probably, most people would say, three of the big economics challenges, social problems that governments around the world faced. Well, I'm going to talk about obesity today, but I'm really going to link it very closely to inequality. And obesity is one of the driving factors in intergenerational inequality, in long-term inequalities. So obesity is a worldwide problem. I'm mainly going to talk about the UK today and policy in the UK, but just to set the scene, obesity is growing around the world, and it's now a more important problem. So being overweight is a bigger problem than being underweight. That changed about 10 years ago. So around 13% of people in the world were estimated to be obese in 2016, and that rate has risen considerably in recent years. And so as I said at the start, governments are getting more and more involved in telling people what they can and can't eat. And what I want to talk today about is, the economics behind, should the government decide for people kind of intrinsically what you eat is a very personal decision and something where you should be best placed to have the right information to take that decision. So why is it that markets aren't working well, that people aren't taking the right decisions? And that comes down to sort of, do people need protecting perhaps from themselves and from outside temptation, largely put there by firms who are selling in the market. So just to give you a few key statistics, obesity is the ratio of weight to height. So I'm 5'5", so if I weighed 72 kilos, I'd be overweight. If I weighed 82 kilos, I'd be obese, just to give you some idea. So this picture shows what's happened over the last few decades in the US and the UK, where you can see that the percentage of the adult population that's obese has risen dramatically. In the UK, going from below 10% in 1975 to over 25% in 2018, I think is the final year. And so about 1 in 7 of the world's population is obese. In the UK, that's 1 in 4. In the US, it's 1 in 3, even higher. So most of what I focus on is about child obesity. So it's a bit more difficult to actually measure obesity in children because they sort of grow. Obesity is the ratio of your weight to your height. Children grow at different rates, and what's counted as obese changes different years. The UK government, along with many other governments, does put a lot of effort into trying to measure this. I'm not going to show you quite the same clean graphs we just saw then. We don't have such a good time series. But we do know that obesity has increased a lot over recent years, and it's very high in the UK. So recent Guardian article, 2019, suggesting that the severe obesity amongst children aged 10 and 11 was at a record high in the UK, with around 4.4% of year 6 pupils needing medical help for obesity, so very high. Sort of more worrying, and again, a bit more of the focus of what I'll talk about today, is that child obesity is worse in more deprived areas. And this provides some of the link between obesity and inequality, and in particular, equality of opportunities. So what we see is that if we look at the graph on the left-hand side of the screen, see that shows the percentage of children that are obese, so all children. If you look in the least deprived regions of the UK, you see around 10% are obese. Whereas if you look in the most deprived, you see that's almost twice as high at 20%. And this inequality has increased over time. So you can see that in the right-hand graph, which runs from 2006 to 2018, and it shows the increase in the inequality. So it shows basically the ratio of obesity in the most deprived to the least deprived regions. And so it shows that this inequality has increased over time, particularly amongst year 6 pupils. And so it's this rising inequality. It's the fact that obesity is rising is itself an issue of concern, but the fact that it's rising much faster in children living in more deprived areas, that's really been one of the driving factors behind the government's concern. So as well as rising obesity, in fact, actually, I'm going to sort of argue it's not really, obesity is one symptom, but the underlying issue that we're really concerned with is rising malnutrition. Obesity is one indicator of malnutrition, ironically, even though it's a sign that children are getting too many calories. Obesity is often associated with an imbalance of calories. So it's too many non-nutritious calories. And that leads to long-term health and mental cognitive consequences, which I'll talk more about later. But one of the things that we particularly see is that, as well as people being obese, we see that people are consuming insane amounts of sugar, way in excess of recommended maximum. So this picture is for the UK, and it shows along the horizontal axis people's age, starting at age 1, going up to 70. And the red line shows you the medically recommended maximum amount of sugar that you should eat each day. So for an adult, that's 30 grams. For children, it's lower. For very young children, it's 0. You should have no added sugar. The black line shows you the mean level of consumption in the UK and shows you that that's well in excess of the recommended maximum at all ages, but particularly around the sort of pre-teen, teen years. But in fact, from a medical point of view, perhaps most worrying me is this very high consumption, consumption above adult maximum levels for very young children. And this level of sugar consumption is thought to be a key concern in terms of adverse consequences for children and forms of nutrition, diet-related diseases. Just to show you a little bit more about that, this is the same sort of statistic. This is the amount of added sugar that people consume in a day. And this is the percentage of young people consuming each of these levels. So this is for children aged 1 to 3, where remember the medically recommended maximum is 0. We see that almost all children are consuming a much more than that. and most are consuming really considerably more than that. So large numbers of children are consuming way, way in excess of the amount of sugar that's medically recommended. And we can just flick through the different age ranges. We see age 4 to 10, we see that a very large number of 4 to 10-year-olds are consuming very, very much in excess of the medically recommended maximum. Same for 11 to 16-year-olds, same for 17 to 21-year-olds. So we see that we have rising obesity. We see that we have, at least in one dimension in sugar, we have very poor consumption habits. This is a quote from a recent report looking at the UN sustainability goals. And it says that the average situation in the UK hides large variation according to socioeconomic status. So I've just shown you a couple pictures that show you that. But what they also highlight is this juxtaposes two challenges: high and growing level of obesities and diet-related disease, what I just showed you, but also amongst the highest levels of household food insecurity in Europe. So we heard a lot about this over the COVID crisis, with Marcus Rashford coming forward talking about problems of food insecurity and the importance of free school meals, for example. And at first blush, it looks like the idea that people would be food insecure is sort of really counter to the idea that children would be obese. But in fact, the two are, in recent work, people have shown that the two are very related. Food insecurity means that the household has volatile amounts of food. So that may mean that some days there's no food, but then there's a lot of food, and maybe very high sugary food. And that type of consumption is in particular bad for children and for the nutritional aspects of brain development and social and physical development. So in fact, food insecurity and obesity really go hand in hand. And we see in places where there's high food insecurity, we also see more obesity. So of course, things have gotten worse over the pandemic. We've seen, as I just mentioned, Marcus Rashford campaigning for free school meals. Many children have not had access to food that they would normally have, for example, in school. And many parents have suffered income shocks, so they've reduced income, making it harder for them to purchase foods. So this is a survey that's been done by the Food Foundation every month since the pandemic started, using YouGov, and they look at the percentage of people in the first 2 weeks from lockdown, then May, July, August, and then most recently January, about just over a month ago. They ask people whether they're food insecure. Were they not able to eat for a whole day? Have they gone hungry? Have they been hungry but not been able to eat because they didn't have access to food? Or did they skip some meals? We see is that there was a really big increase in food insecurity just at the start of lockdown. And it is, things have gotten a little bit better, but still remain very high, okay? So what are the reasons that for this type of food insecurity? And so what they show here, this looks at the percentage of people who said they were food insecure. It asks them why. So at the beginning of the pandemic, it was largely to do with supply issues. People weren't able to get to the store. They got to the store and the food that they wanted wasn't available. They were scared to go to the store, particularly that's more relevant for older people who were vulnerable to COVID and they didn't want to go out to the store, and online shopping slots were booked up. So initially supply was a really big problem. That's gotten better over time. People, the stores themselves have figured out how to supply, and people have figured out ways of getting food with help from neighbors, etc. And now the bigger issue is economic issues. As people have lost jobs and income has been reduced, more people are facing food insecurity because they don't have sufficient income. And then there's a bunch of other issues to do with mental health and other reasons that people may have trouble securing a regular supply of healthy food. So things have gotten worse in many dimensions over the pandemic, and this is one of them. In addition, things have gotten worse in another way. Of course, obesity is about the amount of food you eat and the quality of the food you eat. and the exercise you do. And so many studies now are showing that children in particular have been much less active. They've been much less likely to leave home, and they've been much less active in the home. And so there's a belief that hasn't been measured yet. There's a belief that we're going to see big increases in child obesity and big increases in diet-related diseases in children, both because they've been eating poorly and because they've been getting less exercise. So there's one of the real pushes and reasons that we think it's important that children get back into school as well as for their education. So I mentioned this already, but just to make it clear, what are the consequences of poor nutrition in childhood, and what's the reason that I'm sort of focusing? So we see rising obesity in adults. We also see it in children. And I think that from a public policy point of view, the issues for children are much greater because of the poor consequences of poor nutrition in childhood. If I pick out a little bit on biscuits, I'm gonna, get a bit fat and not look so good, but long-term consequences are moderate for a grown-up person. Whereas for a child, there's a growing body of evidence that shows that it really can lead to adverse health, social, and economic outcomes. So the question, the issue that we're trying to confront is that a young child may not be fully thinking, and their parents may not be fully thinking through the consequences of that poor diet for their long-term social and economic outcomes, and that this poor nutrition may be, one important source of lack of socioeconomic mobility and a lack of opportunity for children. So these, poor food, and insecure diet in the household may lead children to develop poor food habits, which they carry on into later life, may also lead to poor development of their metabolism, something called metabolic syndrome, that being malnourished in childhood leads your metabolism to act in ways that persist into adulthood and mean that you're more likely to be obese and to have health problems later in life. And those health consequences are at least correlated, and we think probably cause social problems and poor economic performance as well. High sugar intake affects cardiometabolic diseases, so leads to later life outcomes. There's a lot of evidence that malnutrition hampers brain development and associated with poor performance at school, maybe associated with ADHD and other things like that. There's possible contributing factors. So these are possibly important contributing factors to a lack of opportunity and intergenerational mobility. And so that's one of the big reasons that we think that there's scope for government to be thinking about how it might be able to improve the life chances of these children by helping their households secure a nutritious diet. So what policy aims to do is to improve diet quality. I've said before, when markets are functioning well, then we think that people left to their own devices to make choices in the market will yield the best outcome. People know what foods they like, they can trade off the costs and benefits of their choices. And the market functions better than the government because people have better information about their own preferences, their own activity levels, and they can make the trade-off better than the government could. However, as I've just shown you a taste of what's the big body of evidence now that suggests that people are making poor choices that lead to later life poor outcomes, which they regret themselves. So they lead to poor choices, both from a social perspective, in the sense that these diet-related diseases lead to costs for the healthcare system, but they also lead to poor consequences for those people themselves in the future. And so the question is whether policy can help those people, those young people in particular, to make better choices when they're young, that they will be happy that they made later on in life. And so what we want to think about is how policy might be able to help them make better choices, but to think carefully about the potential unintended consequences of policy. So I mentioned already briefly about these externalities and internalities. From a social policy perspective, what are the consequences of this? So one, a traditional externality argument, which provides a reason for intervention, is that obesity yields costs that are borne by wider society. It's more expensive for the NHS to treat people who are obese. Obesity itself is an increased risk factor for other diseases. We saw that with COVID, for example. People who are obese who get COVID are much more likely to have complications, have long COVID, for example, or even to die. And so we spend more on treatment of obesity than we do on many other types of things. And so that type of traditional externality is one rationale for government intervention. Another, and I think more compelling rationale, is what's called internalities. So internalities are like externalities, but they're on the person themselves in the future. So as a 4-year-old child, I may be wanting to eat a Mars bar. And when I take the decision about eating that Mars bar, I just think about how yummy it's going to be. I don't think about the fact that I'm going to get totally hyper on sugar, do poorly at school that day, lead me to get poor grades, not going to be able to go to university. I'm going to be stuck in a low-paying job for the rest of my life. So that's an internality. The choice I make today has consequences for the future that I myself don't think about. And so we do a lot of, there's a lot of government intervention to help ensure that children make good choices for themselves. For example, making it mandatory that children go to school, making it illegal to drink alcohol when you're under the age of 18, etc. So there's a whole slew of policies that we use to ensure that children grow up and have good opportunities. And food choices are one where it seems like, at least for some households, the children and their parents are not making good choices for those children. And we think it's the case that they later regret those choices. And so if we could use policy to enable them to make better choices, then those children would be better off. They'd grow up to lead more fulfilling and productive lives and be happy about that. So what we want is policy that can help people make better choices, i.e. that reduces the externalities and reduces the internalities. We don't want to just reduce the consumption of donuts and sugar. We want to specifically target the consumption that creates externalities and internalities. If my friend who's a marathon runner eats a Mars bar while running a marathon, there's no internality or externality there. And there's really no business of the government to get involved in changing that decision. So we want policies to be targeted and to be targeted at correcting the externalities and internalities. So to design policy, we need to understand why people are making bad choices so that we can help them make better choices. We need to understand how specific policies or combinations of policies, more likely, will affect different people. So is it well targeted at those people with the highest externalities and internalities? And then we need to think about what other effects the policies might have. So what are the unintended consequences? How, for example, might a tax lead firms to change other behaviors? And this is, where economics is particularly well suited to answering these questions about how specific policies work and what the effects of these policies might be. In terms of why people are making bad choices, there's a bit of work, but honestly, the work there is less clear and it's going to be a bit more speculative. So I'm just going to talk through those now. But that's an area, what exactly these internalities arise from and how big they are is an area where we have relatively little information. The evidence base is growing, but it's still pretty new. And so what are some of the candidate reasons that we think that markets might not be working, i.e. that people interacting, making free decisions and using market signals like price might not be making the best decisions? So one possibility is that they don't have information. We might think that people just don't know what are good foods and bad foods. So of course, when people used raw ingredients and cooked, we probably think that most people know that broccoli is healthy and that sugar is not healthy. But once you start buying food that's processed, that has a lot of ingredients, it becomes much less transparent. And so, of course, we already have a lot of regulation and legislation that firms have to tell us in a standard format, like the back of package labeling. They have to give us the information about what's in the food packet. So certainly, like starting from the 50s onwards, there has been a lot of government intervention trying to provide additional information to people about what are the nutritional characteristics of the foods they eat and about what are good nutritional characteristics. What should a balanced diet look like, for example? So information is certainly one area. It's one where we probably already, have a good amount of information, but has certainly been an area for government policy in the past. One that people have been paying more attention to recently, and particularly economist Sendhil Mullainathan, who did a lot of work, he was at Harvard and now is at Chicago, that did a lot of work more in low-income countries, looking at, we see an association between poverty and a lot of bad outcomes, including obesity, but also bad financial decision-making. And a lot of economists have asked, well, why do we see that? Is that a causal relationship? Does poverty cause bad decision-making? Or does bad decision-making cause poverty? Or just both of them associated with some other activity that we don't know what it is? So what's the relationship between those? So Sendhil Mullainathan and colleagues did some interesting work with psychologists to think about how poverty in itself may be a sort of absorbing state that taxes the brain, that makes it difficult for people to make good decisions. And so we often see the poor behaving in less capable ways, which further perpetuates poverty. That's true for obesity. And so, what could we do about that if we, for example, gave people more money, if we had more social universal credit or something like that, if we used the tax and benefit system to transfer more money to people to lift them out of poverty, would that help solve the problem? Or are people in poverty exactly because of this bad decision making? So this theory, and there's evidence for this, suggests that actually it's poverty itself that leads people to taking bad decisions, such that if you can lift people out of poverty, they will stop making bad decisions. So what's the idea behind this? The idea is that this is done with psychologists, is that if you look at the way that people make decisions, so you look at human mental bandwidth, there's a lot of evidence that shows that this is finite. People can only really think of a finite number of things at a time. So you can see this, for example, in something called chunking, which is why we write phone numbers the way we do. It's hard for people to remember 7 numbers, so we chunk it up into 3 numbers, 4 numbers. That's the American system, at least. But that's true in general, that if you look at how we lecture, for example, you're taught, give people 3 ideas. It's hard for students to remember more than 3 ideas at once. They're saying 7, but the point is it's a finite number of things. And so if you're in poverty, there's a whole bunch of things that you have to do to cope with life. And those things may be absorbing and may make it difficult for you, it's called cognitive overload, to have the capacity to invest in the things that would allow you to be lifted out of poverty, to study, to search for a new job, to remember to pay bills, to shop and get a nutritious diet. So, why is it that we see that households living in more deprived areas buy and eat less nutritious food? Is it because they can't afford it? Actually, food's pretty cheap in the UK. And most people are pretty proximate to a supermarket that sells healthy food reasonably cheaply. So maybe there's something else that's driving that. Maybe it's this cognitive overload, which is difficulty in getting to the shop every day and choosing the right set of food such that you can cook a nutritious meal, and just dealing with all of that decision making. So that's something that a lot of behavioral economists in particular have been paying more attention to. Another kind of related behavioral issue that people have focused on is saying, well, are people making bad choices because they lack self-control? Do people really, what lacking self-control means is that if you ask someone ahead of time, would you prefer to eat an apple or would you prefer to eat a donut? They say, well, I should eat the apple. That's better for me. I'd like to eat the apple. But then in the moment that you give them the food, they choose the donut. So that's called a self-control problem. means that you have inconsistent preferences. It means that if I ask you ahead of the consumption decision, you make one choice, which we kind of think of as your true long-term preferences. But then in the moment of consumption, you get tempted and you lack self-control. And so you make the bad decision. And so this is from a paper of mine with several colleagues where we look at, this is Google searches for the word diet. And what you see is that every January, this spikes. People search for the word diet, and then that declines over the year. And then again, they search for it and then it declines. And you see exactly the same pattern if you if you put in healthy foods or healthy eating or all sorts of other like healthy behaviors. And when you look at the foods that people buy, you see exactly the same pattern. People have periodic resets where they exert self-control and they become their best self and they eat a healthy diet for some period of time, and then they deteriorate and then they reset again. So January is a really dominant point in that cycle. But you see it happening at many other times too. People just before Valentine's Day, they exert more self-control. Just before a big birthday, they exert more self-control. So there's quite a bit of a growing body of evidence that people lack some kind of self-control and that they get tempted into eating unhealthy foods. And so that suggests that if we could remove this temptation, or if we could give people the ability to commit themselves to being their best self, that may help them make better food choices. And so there's a lot of attention now paid to the way that advertising may interact with this self-control problem and distort people, tempt people into taking decisions that they don't really want to and that is not in their long-term interests. Right? And so restricting advertising, in the UK, we already restrict advertising to children of many goods, including junk foods. And there's currently legislation going through Parliament to look at possibly restricting that further, to restricting advertising of junk foods at all times of day, not just to children, but to adults as well. So I've mentioned some policies that have been implemented, and there's many more that people are discussing. So the food industry is already an area where the government intervenes a lot. The government gives people advice on eat well plate, what's a balanced diet. I just mentioned they restrict advertising to children. The government gives advice, look out for hidden salt, eat 5 fruit and veg a day, etc. So there's all sorts of policies that we already have, but many more are being considered. And places like the World Health Organization have big long documents advocating a large number of policies. So let's talk through some of those main policies, and in particular, thinking back to the questions we asked about how well are those policies targeting the key market failures, and are they targeting those individuals who have the highest externalities and internalities, and are there potentially any unintended consequences? So what are some of the policies that we already have? So we already have a lot of policies that provide information. The government telling us eat 5 portions of fruit and veg a day, trying to give a simple message to, on average, most people consume about 2.5 portions a day. So this is saying, really you need to eat a lot more than you currently do of raw fruit and veg. Look out for hidden salt, or this kind of different types of labeling. I showed you earlier the front of package, the back of package labeling, which is written in very small font size. So the government has introduced recently more traffic light schemes, where this red indicates there's too much saturated fat in this product, that's bad for you. And so introducing, providing information and trying to provide it in more accessible and easy to act on ways. In the UK, there was a voluntary policy actually by which all supermarkets have now removed, well, almost all, not quite all, but nearly all, have removed chocolate and candy from the tills in supermarkets. And in particular, they removed these really low shelves, which were attractive for children. So they did this in part because the government sort of said, if you don't sort something out, we're going to actually legislate. And so it's kind of voluntary regulation on behalf of the supermarkets, with the knowledge that if they didn't do something themselves, the government would legislate. And the idea of that is to help people to exert self-control. So these items are still available in the supermarket. You just have to walk to the specific aisle to get them. And so in particular, it was, the idea that it enables parents to exert self-control over their children and not have the pester power of the children sitting there looking at the chocolate and buying it. And initial studies suggest that this has actually been reasonably effective, and it's seen a reduction in purchases of these types of tempting goods. So that's an example of a way that policy might, change the food environment in ways that enable people to exert self-control that they want to exert themselves. Another policy that's been discussed and not yet implemented is to do with portion sizes. So this graphic shows what's happened to the average portion size between 1990 and 2019 in the UK. So the size of a bagel has increased by 29%, the size of a pack of crisps by 50%, of pizza by 53%. So actually, again, the government said to the industry, if you don't do something about this, we're going to regulate. And we saw over the last year or so, we've seen quite a lot of what's called shrinkflation, where we've seen the pack size of things like chocolate bars have become smaller. So of course, that means they become more expensive per unit of food, if you like, but in a way that perhaps leads people to consume less of them, to sort of reversing this trend. So that was another way that kind of helped enable people to exert self-control. It's hard to buy a pizza and only eat half of it. Whereas if you reduce the portion size, then that may be more effective. Similarly, Sally Davis, who is the health minister at the time, when she left being advisor to the health minister, she suggested that there should be a ban on eating on public transport to stop, again, to help people exert self-control, so to stop children eating on the way home from school. That policy hasn't been implemented, and that's not really a realistic policy to be implemented. But the idea was, again, the government thinking broadly about how it could help people to exert self-control. So a policy that has been implemented in a lot of places, including the UK, is a tax on sugary drinks. So, taxes are a very common place where economists look when we think there's internalities or externalities to try to correct those. We have taxes on alcohol, on cigarettes, on petrol, on carbon, to try and bring the private cost more closely aligned to the social cost. So sugary drinks taxes are another way of doing that. Particularly attractive way of doing that because it also raises revenue for government, which either can be used to help reduce the cost of the externality or just for other reasons. So this is a map from 2019 showing all the countries in the world that had sugary drink taxes. There were about 50. And the UK in 2018 introduced one called the Soft Drinks Industry Levy. And that's actually been seen to be pretty effective. It's both reduced total consumption of sodas, but it's also led many of the producers of soft drinks to reformulate them so they have less sugar in them. The tax is on the amount of sugar in the drink, and so firms had an incentive to reduce the amount of sugar to lower the tax rate. So in a survey article that we did at the IFS, we looked at all the studies that had been done of all the soda taxes in the world, and we found that soda taxes were pretty effective at increasing prices. The pass-through was pretty much full when you looked at similar settings to the UK. So the tax was effective in that way, and that the tax led to an increase in price. So kind of used the market to send the right signals to consumers. And in most cases, it led to substantial reductions in purchases. So why might not those two things happen? So first of all, if you think about the soda market is oligopolistic. There's a small number, Coke and Pepsi basically, and a few other firms that sell sodas. And so these firms have market power. So when we implement a tax, it's not necessarily the case that that tax will lead to an increase in prices. In perfectly competitive markets, it always would, because prices at marginal cost prior to the implementation of the tax, so the price would go up. In markets where firms are already earning some profits, firms could decide instead to reduce their profit margins a bit. And we do see that in some markets. But at least in the soda market, for various reasons, we see that taxes were largely passed through to prices. Why might not it lead to substantial reductions in purchases of soda? That depends on how responsive consumers are. And in particular, the types of consumers that we're trying to target are those that really like sugar, like consumers that eat a lot of sugar, and they may be particularly unresponsive to price if they really love sugar. So we saw that, for example, with cigarette taxes, that there were a hardcore of smokers who were mostly quite poor people who continued to smoke and paid the very high taxes. And so there's some concern that we're then making those people poorer because we're making them pay higher prices and we're not reducing their consumption. So there's a lot of discussion about the equity effects of these types of taxes. So in work that we've done, we try and look in more detail than just looking at the kind of what's it done to aggregate consumption, but really to ask, does it target the groups of consumers that have high internalities and externalities? And so when we do this, we can do two different types of analysis. One is the type of ex post, or after the tax has been implemented, or what you may have seen as difference in difference analysis, which most of the studies I just talked about were. Or another type of work that become more popular recently is called structural analysis, where we use data and economic theory to estimate people's behavior in more detail. This requires more assumptions. It requires more assumptions from economic theory, sometimes more data, but importantly, it lets us to really better understand the mechanisms by which policies work. And so both explore unintended consequences of policies, but also better understand whether it's really helping to correct the market failure, whether it's really getting at the target group of consumers and really, having the intended consequence. So in work that we did, we looked at the effect of the UK soda tax. And so who do we want to target with the soda tax? We want to target people with the largest internalities. Who are these? These are the youngest people, as I described before. Having too much sugar when you're young has many adverse consequences, and they're heavy consumers. Very heavy consumption of sugar has adverse consequences. And so the question that we wanted to ask in this work is, are these groups responsive to tax? And if so, then consumers. Sorry, that's the wrong word there. So if they don't respond to the tax, then the tax reduces welfare. That's because these consumers now have to pay a higher price, but they still experience the internalities. If they are responsive, then they can't buy the product that they like, but they gain in the long run due to the reduction in the internalities. So we need to estimate a model to understand whether they're better off. So in work we did, as I said, that has lots of fancy econometrics and very cool, large, big data behind it, we estimate exactly that. This picture summarizes the result. It looks at, in this axis here, the height of the bars shows you the reduction in sugar due to the soda tax. Along the front axis, we have consumers ranked from low sugar consumers to high sugar consumers. And then along the axis that runs from front to back, we have young people towards the back and old people towards the front. And so what you can see in this is you can see that young people are more responsive to the tax. So young people do reduce the amount of sugar they consume by more in response to the tax. So that's good. Young people were one of the targeted groups due to high internalities. But if you look at the gradient with respect to whether you're a low or high sugar consumer, you see things go exactly the wrong way. Low sugar consumers respond a lot because they don't actually like sugar that much. And so they respond, if it becomes a bit more expensive, then they're very willing to move away from it. Whereas high sugar consumers really like sugar a lot. They have very strong preferences for sugar, so they respond a lot less to the tax. So there's kind of good news and bad news there. So the evidence suggests that the young are responsive, the heavy consumers are not. So what the government's talking about now is there scope for further use of these taxes? For example, this is a tax on sugar in soda. What about a sugar tax more generally? Well, we'd need to understand more about who would be responsive to that. If heavy consumers are not responsive, then we might make them worse off by increasing prices without really improving their long-term life consequences. And in particular, one of the things that we've seen, if we look over many decades, is that food prices in the UK have declined up until recently, when we had the depreciation of sterling, for example, and Brexit, of course, has brought them back up. But this long-term decline in food prices has led to first-order welfare gains for poor households who spend more of their budget on food. And so using prices as an instrument has potential unintended consequences in that it may shift people away from certain types of foods, but it also may make food more expensive for them and make them poorer. And if that is a big effect and perpetuates poverty, then that's an adverse unintended consequence. Okay, so I just want to spend my last couple of minutes talking about another type of policy that's being considered, it's being expanded. So what effect do advertising restrictions have? So in the UK, we already have some restrictions to the amount of adverts that children can see, and the government's thinking of widening that. So it wants to restrict adverts for junk foods, unhealthy foods, basically. And so the idea is that adverts for junk foods are basically persuasive. They try and convince you that this is a nice food, and they distract you from the unhealthy characteristics of the food, or in fact from the price. And so that banning them would lead people to make better choices. So that, what adverts do is lead you to make bad choices. And so if we ban that, people will make better choices. So what do we mean by persuasive advertising? We mean like these types of adverts for crisps. So these are not telling you anything about the product. They're just trying to convince you that if you eat crisps, you'll be a great football star or a beautiful model. Of course, that's not true. Crisps have fat and salt in them, which are bad for you. So these are persuasive, they're distorting people's decision making. And we see that's the common type of advert in junk food markets. So let's just think through in a really simple economic model, what would happen if we banned adverts. So if we think about what firms do, what do firms like Coke do? They compete with Pepsi in both advertising and in prices. If we ban advertising, what that's going to mean is, first of all, consumers pay more attention to price and other characteristics like of the unhealthiness of it. So that's good. That's going to lead consumers to make better choices based on the actual characteristics of the products. However, what might be some of the unintended consequences? Well, now firms can no longer compete in advertising, so they're going to compete more in price. In addition, consumers are paying more attention to price, so that's going to make price competition even tougher. So both of these mean that price competition is going to lead to a reduction in price. And that reduction in price will lead to an increase in quantity. So while consumers are making better decisions and they cut back on their consumption because they're no longer taking distorted decisions, the unintended consequences, the new market equilibrium, leads to lower prices. And so that almost offsets the first effect. So consumers are better off, they've paid lower prices, they're eating healthier foods, but there hasn't been a reduction in the amount of junk food purchased. So perhaps having a ban on advert in combination with a tax that brings the price back up could work, but we need to think about how these policies work together and what kind of unintended consequences these may have. So just to summarize, there's compelling evidence that people make suboptimal choices regarding food consumption. And in particular, there's compelling evidence in young children, and that they're making decisions that lead to poor lifetime outcomes for them. Policy can potentially make people better off by protecting them from themselves and from outside temptation. Or children, think about like encouraging their parents to make better decisions on their behalf. But to be effective, policies must address the market failures and must be well targeted. There are many reasons why individuals and firms' behaviors might undermine the ability of policy to achieve these aims. And it's important, that we think about the ways that policies might in fact make people worse and even reduce welfare if, for example, we make people poor but don't lead to them having a better quality diet. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't implement policies. We for sure should, but we need to do so intelligently and with complete information. It also, I've talked less about this, but it's likely that taxes, policies like tax, which raise revenue, and like banning advertising, which don't cost anything to government at least, are very attractive, while substantive policies such as education and lifting households out of poverty through free school meals, etc., are likely to have bigger long-term impacts, but of course are very expensive. And so particularly in the current climate, may be unrealistic. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much. So I know you kind of touched on this a little bit in the end, but one question we had here was kind of what other alternative policy options still within the realm of not trying to tackle the big problems of like inequality and poverty and those kind of things, but similar to like a sugar tax or an advertising ban. Potentially, are there any other routes that policy could go down in regards to solving this problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the two policies really most on the table are those two, taxes and banning advertising. Though one of the things that the government's thinking a lot about is policies that can encourage firms to reformulate. So there's a lot of consumers, and people tend to have pretty strong habits in their food consumption. So changing people is actually pretty hard, whereas changing firms is a little bit easier, perhaps. We also might think in some ways that firms have less kind of behavioral biases, if you like. So one of the things the government's trying to think about is ways that it can encourage reformulation. So of course, taxes can do that, and advertising bans can do that, but there may be other types of regulation that could encourage firms to reduce the amount of sugar and salt. That'd be particularly effective if we think that people don't really know that they're consuming as much salt and sugar. So it's not really something they have strong preferences over. They're just inadvertently consuming it. Then targeting reformulation would be a really effective policy.
So again, like kind of on this individual consumer behavior point, I know you mentioned it's pretty hard to change, but I was just curious thinking about, I know in the US, specifically with cigarettes, like if you do try to buy tobacco or cigarettes, there's like a big sign on it from like the US Surgeon General saying like, this can lead to lung cancer. I don't know if it's the same here, but potentially if there are any kind of policy solutions kind of in that manner that could potentially work. I know it's probably a bit more complicated for food, but.
No, so again, that's a great question. So it is a little more complicated for food because with cigarettes, like the government doesn't care. It just doesn't want you to smoke. Whereas with food, of course, like it's not that we don't want people to eat, they have to eat. So it's a kind of more nuanced decision. But the policy that's most like that is calorie labeling. So in the US, again, I think in some states, I don't think in all states, you have to have a sign in any fast food restaurant of the number of calories in anything you buy, and there has to be a certain size. So if you go into like McDonald's fast food restaurants, you see the calories are posted quite large. So you're starting to see that in some places in the UK. There have been some studies that show that affects that people, if they see the calories there in a large font, then it will change their decision making. So like in the UK, like Pret a Manger, for example, has calories, but they're in a very small font, so you don't really see it. But I know that that's a policy that has been considered, though is not currently on the cards.
That's interesting. So another question we have here is kind of, like you mentioned, trying to strike that balance between like deterring people away from these kind of foods, but also ensuring that people within lower income brackets aren't spending more and more on food if that happens through taxes. So kind of, how do you kind of judge, especially looking at this, if you're doing like a study of sugary taxes, or sugary drinks, sorry, how do you kind of distinguish between the potential negative effects from increased prices, but also the potential benefits that you have from people being deterred away and potential nutritional benefits there?
Well, so again, great question. There's a lot of bits to that though. So the very straightforward answer is in standard economic models, we have a very direct measure of welfare. So if people are, I'm going to call it rational, if people are using information and we can write down a model that contains, that describes the way they're using information, then we can usually get compensating variation, which is kind of what we think of as welfare. So we can exactly measure how much worse off people are versus how much better off they are if we have some measure of the long-term benefits to them from a healthier diet. We don't actually have very good estimates of that, but we could make some approximation. That becomes a lot more difficult when you start adding these behavioral considerations. So when I talked about, for example, advertising, and in fact, in the work that I did on advertising, we have a whole section on how do you think about the welfare effects of that, because people have different preferences. The point is that advertising changes your preferences. So in order to evaluate people's well-being, you need to use their preferences. So what are your correct set of preferences? Is it the one when you're tempted and, advertising is making you think that eating, junk food is great because you want to be like Gary Lineker? Or is it your sort of good set of preferences where you want to eat healthy food? And so this is one place that economists and like health researchers really differ, in that health researchers are just like, you got to use the healthy good preferences and we don't really care about the utility that people get from eating junk food. In economics, we tend to think that if people like something and they get, if we eat things because we like them, and if I eat a piece of cake and I get pleasure out of it, we should count that as an increase in my welfare and offset that against the price. But if I'm distorted if I'm eating that piece of cake and getting utility from it, but it's having long-term consequences, we have to balance those things out, and that becomes more tricky. So we have economic tools to do that, but it becomes more complicated.
Okay. So interestingly enough, our next question is pretty similar to this. So the question is that we've had a pretty in-depth discussion of kind of deterring people away from these kind of unhealthy foods, but potentially looking at the other side, is there any ways we can incentivize healthy foods? So kind of just the flip side of what you're discussing.
Yeah, again, it's a great question. So actually there are a lot of policies that do that already. So in the UK, for example, we have a policy called Healthy Start vouchers, and there's a similar policy in the US, which gives poor households who are on benefits, vouchers that can only be used to buy healthy foods. But more importantly, and what people think is probably the bigger piece of that, is that they're delivered by a health visitor who talks to the parents about what healthy food is for young children. And they come with little recipe cards. So again, you see in many schools now, I'm not sure if this is legislation, if just many schools do it, many schools teach how to cook, and children have to, I don't know what age, 12-year-olds or something like that, 14-year-olds have to cook a meal and have the ingredients together. So there are definitely very active programs that are trying to encourage more home cooking. One area of my own research that I didn't talk a lot about is that one of the big things you see over time is that people are spending less time preparing food. People buy much more processed foods. And so and processed food tends to be less healthy than prepared foods. So a lot of the positive messages are about trying to get people back into using ingredients and cooking foods. Eat 5 a day is a positive message. So there's a lot of discussion about whether the government should, encourage people firms to put fruit and veg on sale more, etc.
Okay, interesting. And then one kind of last question that I was a little bit curious about is potentially the effects of school lunches and what is given in a school lunch, like if that has an effect on kind of setting the tone of what people think is acceptable as a meal, and also kind of maybe the impact that has on nutritional. So I was wondering if you had any or had looked into that.
So the big driving factor behind free school meals is that having a nutritious diet before you sit down to learn has been shown to be incredibly important. That children going to school when they're hungry or when they don't have nutritious food is really detrimental to their ability to learn. So that's been a policy for a long time in the US in particular. So there is a big debate in the UK about how nutritious are preschool meals actually. And we saw the Jamie Oliver campaign several years ago, and then more recently we've seen some of the controversy about the fact that the meals that are provided are in themselves not necessarily that nutritious. They're not full of sugar though, so they're better than perhaps the average meal. Do they set norms and set people's habits? I don't think we know about that yet. I think people think of them basically as like a transfer of income, but just in kind, that ensures that children have that. It's a very expensive way to provide food though. I mean, the government, it would be much cheaper for the government to give people vouchers. The question is whether those vouchers would be spent on food for the children. And so the advantage of providing food in school is that you know that the child gets it at the time when they're learning. Of course, that's not so true when they're learning at home. And so there is a whole discussion about what's the best way to structure that kind of program. But those types of programs have been shown to be very effective at increasing nutrition in children.
Great. So thank you so much for your time and for answering all these interesting questions. Just for our viewers that are watching, so this Friday we have Rajeshwari Sengupta talking about the Indian economy. And then next Tuesday, we have Timothy Geithner talking about kind of his time working with the US government, working with the Obama administration. So keep your eyes out for those events next week. Thank you for everyone for watching. And then thank you again for Professor Griffith for your time.
Thanks a lot.
Amazing.
Cheers. Bye.